2, and 1. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, audience, members of the public. My name is Leila Latif, and I'm from Cardiff University. And around me are also my colleagues from Cardiff University from the sub-Saharan continent. On my right, I have Smith Elmer, who's a Kenyan scholar and an author of a book on land law. His research is along the lines of urbanization and looking at the impacts on the right to health. Here is Felicity Kalunga. She's from Zambia, and her research is going to be looking at basically administrative law and justice. Next to her is my colleague Meji Mahoba. Hopefully I've said that the South African way of pronouncing the word right. And he's basically looking at BEE, which is an abbreviated version of the Black Economic Empowerment with respect to South Africa, its apartheid policy, and the impact it has had on policy and lawmaking. On my left, we are happy to have in our audience a lieutenant colonel all the way from the Nigerian army, but he's not in an official capacity. He's here as a scholar, a PhD researcher, and he's looking at the role of Nigeria in basically having an advent into the Security Council. Here is my other Abyssinian colleague. Abyssinia used to be a historical country, but now we call it Ethiopia, a global emerging power. And Mulugeta Siseri is basically going to be talking about reducing emissions from cars. That's the thesis that he's also researching on at Cardiff Law. The beautiful lady here is Faith Simiyu, my Kenyan colleague as well. As you can see, Kenya here is dominant. And her research looks at indigenous rights vis-a-vis the right to health. We have a member of our audience, Shara from Canada, and she will be contributing to the discussions we're going to be having here. So following these discussions, briefly talk about this regional dialogue that we are having. One of these days we just felt that it would be important as doctoral researchers to get our heads together to try and find ways to recommend policy and legal solutions to the problems that we are facing globally and in our local context. So we came up with this African Scholars Roundtable Dialogue, which is here. And the first topic today is going to be about democracy and public participation. We want to try and understand whether there is any link between democracy and public participation in law and policy making that is beneficial to the ordinary local communities in our respective countries. So I'm going to start off by throwing a question to Smith Omar. So thank you so much for coming for our very first session. My question to you is, well, as we're trying to understand and conceptualize democracy and how public participation can feature as a democratic tool, in your research, when you're looking at urbanization, are you seeing any links or connections between public participation and urbanization in the context of democracy?
Okay, thank you so much, Leila. And I feel very honored to be in the presence of all these great scholars. Firstly, I'd like to start by saying that the question of public participation is a question that is very prominent in all spheres of governance in Kenya. And what I'll be speaking about today is particularly the sphere of land governance. And to narrow it down more, will be a question of urban planning, which has a very close link to how land is governed. And Kenyans in 2010 saw it fit to enact a constitution that has been held to be transformative, a constitution that has been held to contain very key provisions on social justice. And one key provision of the Constitution that will be relevant to our discussion today is the provision in Article 10, which speaks of the national values and principles of governance. And we'll go specifically to the principle outlined in Article 10(2), which speaks about the need to involve members of the public in all spheres of public governance. This also includes governance when it relates to questions of land. The Constitution also recognizes the fact that Kenyans must be treated with human dignity, and it envisions an expanded space for social justice and an inclusive space. So this means that any decisions to do with land governance, any decisions to do with urban planning must follow those spirits outlined in Article 10 of the Constitution. And specifically also like to talk about Article 56 of the Constitution that talks about minorities and marginalized groups, because the history of urban planning in Kenya has been a history that has engendered exclusion of certain groups that have been considered to be invisible in the city. So Article 56 of the Constitution envisions the involvement of all these groups, the poor, marginalized groups like women and the youth, in governance and planning. So Parliament and all state institutions are supposed to involve members of the public in participating in these governance processes, and these also include in processes to do with planning in our respective spheres. Article 60 of the Constitution also talks about the national, the principles of land policy in the country, and public participation is a principle that we can see being predominant in all these provisions of the Constitution that I've been talking about. But before we even go back to the Constitution, we need to look at a brief history of how urban planning has been happening in our country. And urban planning, as I said earlier, has been happening in a manner that is very exclusionary. Initially, when a city like Nairobi was founded, it was founded on colonial segregatory lines, where plans were made for one dominant group, that is the Europeans, as against providing for the African majority in the city. So Nairobi grew and developed as a racial city, as a racially segregated city, where the Africans were treated as invisible in the city. And we've seen this practice of urban planning continuing even post-independence, because during the post-independent period, the city of Nairobi still continued to use the 1948 master plan that was established for a colonial city. So we can still see these colonial exclusionary ideologies informing planning in the city, and also resource allocation. So we've had this group that has been socially excluded from participating in the city, from benefiting from the resources and opportunities in the city, while another group, which consists of the rich and people who can access land, have been given priority when it comes to access to resources and opportunities in the city. But we've seen a lot of resistance by this group that has been excluded from planning practices, resistance that has been brewed by the 2010 Constitution, which transforms the governance conditions in our country. So these groups have challenged the dominant exclusionary planning ideologies, and we can now see an expanded space for public participation with regards to urban planning. So I don't know if that answers you.
It does perfectly. I mean, you've given us a nice historical background about what the problem used to be, and how the Constitution came to fix this particular problem, to involve these neglected, marginalized minority groups, for them to be able to participate in how they want their lands to be planned for them. Now, if I was to just throw this question back to Meji, because there's something similar in the mining sector that's taking place, where the argument is, well, the mining contracts are being granted without the input of public participation. Now, noting that Kenya has heavily borrowed from the South African Constitution, and the principle of participation is inherent as part and parcel of the Constitution of South Africa, the Grundnorm. What's your opinion? Do you think the mining contracts, vis-a-vis what the Constitution says, has the Constitution, the democratic nature of South Africa, has it implemented public participation in the mining sector, or is it still missing?
I think the idea of public participation in South Africa, it's window dressing, partly because in 1994, when we changed government, we did not redirect or restructure the fundamentals, designs of society and the economy. So we are still an apartheid society, in which apartheid has been privatized. We still approach governance through frameworks of colonialism, where black people remain marginalized. So what the Constitution did was to depoliticize problems in the mining sector. The issue is decision making, not whether people should participate. So what happened is, by virtue of bringing this glorified managerialist constitution, which doesn't understand South African politics, we kind of depoliticize the problem. Number one, we operate with the thesis that South Africa is a post-racial society, whereas we're a racialized society for over 350 years. And what the question did was to ask the fundamental questions about the haves and the haves not. It was to kind of develop a mechanism to cope with oppression, whereas the structure of neo-apartheid still exists. Because if you check now, what apartheid worked was to derealize the lives of African people. They don't have voice, they don't have dignity, because they have actually lost the status of being humans. And now you did not advance a process which is going to repair people. Remember that our people did not have access to school, education, healthcare, and those problems are now reproduced in the aspect of mining in terms of participation. You give me the right to participate, but you don't give me the means to take part in the decision-making process. In that way, participation processes reproduces existing oppressive structures of power because it doesn't understand the fundamental political question, which is black people in South Africa do not have dignity. And what the ANC government did was they never ever have our interests at heart. Because even today we have a situation in the Eastern Cape. A mining company has been wanting to mine there. Now the government is forcing the community to agree to the mining company or to agree to mining, even though they have said, we don't want to mine, we are happy with our way of living here. We don't think mining is going to bring the right livelihood into our community. But the government now has decided that they will continue with mining, even though that community said no. Lastly, since that Australian company wanted to mine in that community, over 10 people have been killed because they said no to mining. But the government, which is in bed with the elite, has continued to marginalize our people. And what the Constitution does, it didn't address the political issue, because remember, socio-economic rights are relational. They are not a position that you carry in a bag to go use it somewhere. Somebody says you have the right to access health care, but the question is, do you have the money to go to the hospital?
I mean, that's the main argument why rights require resources. You can't talk about enforcement of a right if there's no bucket scheme of money to back it up. But it's interesting, the analysis you bring out about that. You could have a right entrenched in the Constitution, but the means for that right to be realized are missing. Now, if I was to ask Felicity, in the context of administrative law, right, you have rights, and you have the right to participate, as the public in decision-making in a particular country. What does the Zambian constitution say about this principle of public participation, and is it being effectively implemented, or is it like in South Africa, noting that you are down south as well, is it something similar to what's happening in South Africa as well, that you have rights but no means to implement them?
Well, unlike South Africa, we don't have a constitutional right to participation. It's not enshrined in the Bill of Rights, but we have a principle of participation that is espoused in the principles of governance, as well as the structure of the constitution that says we have a multi-party democratic country, and then people have the right to participate directly or through the elected representatives. And the most prominent way is through the elected representatives. So the constitution creates spaces. For instance, in the legislative process, there is an obligation to allow the public to participate in the process. And one of the ways that that is done is through allowing members of the public to make submissions to parliamentary committees on various subjects. But even if with that space, and borrowing from what Meiji is saying about the social, enabling people to participate effectively. So even in those spaces, you'll find that they are not very open spaces. So the committees would have a list of people that would want to contribute. For instance, if it's an act, like currently there's a bill that proposes to amend mental health legislation to repeal the old act. So pick a list of stakeholders that they would like to contribute, and most of the time they go to institutions and NGOs. Although the public in general can make submissions, the requirements are that the submission should reach the assembly like 2 weeks before the submission, and this information is not well publicized. You would have to have access to either the parliament website or actively visit a constituency office, which most people would not do because they don't have the capacity or enough civic education to know what to do.
So you're actually saying that the principle of public participation is not entrenched in the Constitution, but it's part of the principles of governance that exists, like it's like a subsidiary legislation to the Constitution or to an act of Parliament.
It's a governance principle in the Constitution, but not in the Bill of Rights. So it's not just
It's
I
a
cannot go to
principle.
court to challenge a right to participation as having been enforced.
Okay, so you probably, if you want to challenge it under admin law, it would be on a breach of a national value or a principle of governance.
It would have to be a principle of governance or a right to be heard under the common law principles of administration.
Well, I think you've raised a number of issues that are very critical, because I think in the Kenyan context as well, when you're looking at public participation, there's this part about getting stakeholders to submit submissions to Parliament, and you're never given enough time. Now, Faith, if just trying to look at the background of your work on indigenous rights and the conversation that we've had here so far. With Smith, we know that the historical background of the Constitution was such that this was a principle that was required, and we now have it. You're hearing from Felicity that it's not something you can go to court and really challenge as a matter of right. And Meji brings out a nice connection to show that there's a disconnect between politics, what the politicians say and do, and what the law is saying and doing. Now, if you're to reflect this into indigenous people, for example, and their right to be able to participate with respect to matters that affect them, and if we're to contextualize this further, the right to health, the principles of availability, accessibility, and quality, how do you see these principles being applied in respect of the indigenous people, and whether you're seeing public participation, coming to coin this connection for them? Is it entrenching their rights further in the Constitution or not?
Yes, to understand, to put it into context, we all know Kenya had the new constitution in 2010, where the devolution was introduced as a form of shelter. And it's very interesting that you raised this question. So the question would be, have indigenous rights been secured through that aspect of devolution? I'll answer in 2 ways. Yes, to a certain extent. And why do I say yes? Because when you look at, I'll give an example of the OGEC. I'm studying the OGEC and their history in terms of participation. They've gone to the local courts, they've gone up to the national courts in Kenya, and they went all the way to the regional court. And the court was talking about public participation of indigenous people in terms of that. And when you look at, when you go on ground, the word is, for the first time since the new constitution was introduced, they had a new member of parliament, an MCA. They managed to elect an MCA, and then the counties were subdivided, and they had their various sub-counties in the various areas for the first time after the 2010 constitution. To that extent, yes, I would argue public participation has been captured in those principles of governance, and specifically in the objects of devolution in Kenya. But on the flip side of the coin, when I talk about my South African brother here, he mentioned about a reproduction of existing systems of power, where in the mining sector, because of inequalities and discrimination and various competing interests, they reproduce all this where there's some who have and there's some who do not have. So in the same way, in the OGEC scenario, when you look at in the health sector, they are an indigenous people, they depend on traditional medicine, but